Thank you very much. It's very exciting to be here and joined by George, of course. Look, we're here to talk about cultural alpha, which is a thesis, a concept that you've been developing all around the idea that the very best or most dangerous founders actually don't have experience in the category that they're building and disrupting. Can you unpack it a bit, take it away, give us the overview?
Yeah, happy to. Hey everybody, thank you for spending time with us today. I'm George, I'm a partner at Sequoia. I think as you know, we do more at seed and pre-seed than any other stage, right? So we spend a lot of time talking to founders, honestly, their rawest moments in time. I think an observation for me coming into Sequoia, I joined from a company called Revolut, and I'm sure many of you know. Revolut in some ways is an archetype for something of cultural alpha, right? Nick and Vlad, of course, came from financial services, but they didn't come from retail banking, right? They were people that had this insight. They could basically bring unnatural levels of technology, innovation, and natural levels of aggression, product velocity to a market that is incredibly large, right, but doesn't have those characteristics native to that market. And I think that's very important in how we look at the kind of companies we've been investing in over decades, from companies like Stripe. Of course, that's true, two young founders going into payments, knowing nothing about payments. But what has changed is now we're in this wonderful era of AI, where the N of venture-backable markets has exploded. To say the obvious, domain expertise takes a long time to develop, but functional expertise is something that is very rich in the tech ecosystem. And I think in today's world, it's about orientating founders to focus on the right problems where they can generate an edge.
Let's go deeper on that, because I think arguably some of the greatest founders of the last 20 years have kind of had this cultural alpha. When you look at Airbnb, you look at Uber, you look at Meta, the founders behind these great companies were not experts in media, experts in transports and logistics, experts in hotels. Why is this so relevant right now in this sort of age of AI that we're in?
Yeah, I think so. In some ways, the archetypes of founders we look at are the same as they've always been, right? We typically evaluate people in some combination of do they have the grit, right, and ambition to go and be a founder that is consistent whether you come from the industry or not. Do you have a level of functional expertise, right? Meaning a competency, it might be software engineering, it might be building product, it might be design, as it was the case of Brian Chesky from Airbnb, things like this, that allow you to basically build an edge in that industry, so it's correlated with success of being successful there. And then, of course, there is domain expertise, right, which is the voice of the customer, understanding very intimately what that customer needs to be successful. I think what we've observed is, again, because AI has just increased that waterfront so aggressively in such a short amount of time, you can't always expect people to be able to repot where they have that domain expertise. But what they can do is they can bring a level of technology understanding to look at the problems, all of the different machinations and workflows that exist in those markets as an outsider, crucially somebody that has not been corrupted by the status quo, right, that exists in that industry, have a kind of fresh perspective. But what they need to do to be able to be successful is be able to acquire that knowledge very quickly, right, and find the structures and find an ability to get exposure to that problem. So firstly, what has changed is the reality of AI. I think secondly, what has changed is we've observed that founders are getting younger and younger, right? You see entrepreneurs who are coming out, maybe building a business for the first time, in the extreme end, sometimes dropping out of high school, frankly, to go and build these companies. But what we know they can do is they have this incredible capacity for learning, right? They have incredibly high slope, as we would say, but sometimes relatively low intercept. And they need to find partners who can help them with that.
And can you maybe share an example either of a founder that you've backed personally or is in the Sequoia portfolio which really has this cultural alpha?
Yeah. And to be clear, you need to build that domain expertise, right? So the question is, how do you do it? But I think two examples I'll share. One, we made an investment in a company called Nevis. This was three guys I worked with at Revolut once upon a time who were attacking the wealth management space. None of them had any experience in working in the wealth management industry. But the reality was they sort of observed that the fundamentals were quite similar to what you've seen in legal, tax, accounting. It's an old school industry. There's lots of manual paperwork. It's relatively low technology penetration. The insight was that they could spend 6 to 9 months going through basically a pretty aggressive boot camp to learn about this industry. And you need to be incredibly structured, right, in building that domain expertise. I think that's one example. I think a second example, we made an investment in a company in New York called With Coverage that's taking on the commercial insurance industry. One of those founders had been a second-time entrepreneur. His co-founder actually was the co-founder of a company called Open Door in the US, so a consumer prop tech, nothing to do with insurance. But in their case, they'd been a customer of these insurance companies in their previous lives. They'd seen the experience they got from that business. They knew they were being overcharged, the experience was poor, but they were technologists, and they realized they could find leverage through the technology.
Yeah, so it's almost like they have a feel for the industry, and then they just go deep, and they become the experts through building, I guess. At Sequoia, you have these things called co-builds, right, which is where you're essentially backing a founder before they have anything, right? So you are looking at the founder just as the founder, before they've got a business, a product, traction. what are you looking for to assess both for cultural alpha, but also just what are they a great founder? How are you assessing that at that very, very early stage?
So I think what is very core to that notion of cultural alpha is this idea that the first 30 employees is probably the most important predictor of success, right, in terms of how your business is going to operate. And that's true in like the absolute sense, right? But part of this notion of culture alpha is its very high talent density relative to the industry.
Yeah.
Right? So you need to look at what the benchmarks are for technology penetration, the kind of talent the incumbents or maybe your competitors are recruiting, and to think about how you can build an edge in that, right? So it's normally some perspective on how to be able to attract, hire, and retain exceptional people that are not necessarily native to that market. So that's the first piece. I think the second piece is, we talk about this idea at Sequoia of having a unique and compelling insight for early stage founders, right? Uniqueness obviously implies different, right, which typically implies gross margin. Compelling implies better, right, which implies revenue growth, and the best companies have gross margin and revenue growth. Hot take. But the way we think about it is combining those two characteristics of an unfair team, right, who are very, again, typically non-native to the industry, combined with this unique and compelling insight, combined with a plan for how they understand the market dynamics that exist in those industries. So what happens is when we think about co-builds, typically this is an opportunity where we're pretty opinionated about the problem at Sequoia, meaning we've done some of the market work to understand some of those market dynamics. We potentially used our reach as a firm, as opposed to the reach of this individual, to go out and speak to customers, validate the problem, form a hypothesis on what these market dynamics may be. But we wouldn't pretend as Sequoia to always know how to solve those problems. So the co-build I would really define as bringing these entrepreneurs with us, typically working, for myself, on 2 or 3 different themes or ideas that we're kind of putting out into the ether, right? And sort of challenging entrepreneurs to come and explore these ideas with us. And sometimes we'll spend 3 to 6 months working with these entrepreneurs before we form the company. At which point, we shake hands, we have max conviction on each other as potential partners, and crucially, maximum conviction on the problem statement and what we want to do.
Has that changed at all since you became an investor, the way that you are having those unique insights as an investor? We're living at a very different time and age to even 5 years ago. Has the way that you been thinking about finding that unique insight changed?
I think what is really important, there's been, for a long time in software, I think there were notions of like latent changes in markets, meaning, there's some understanding that like technology penetration will generally go up, systems will be digitized and ideally in the future be automated. But there wasn't always a very clear why now for the industry, right? You could sit there and think about this like long-term structural change. Examples would be in industries like healthcare, for example, right? Where there was always a notion there was so much administration, so much manual work. But here we are in 2026 and the world looks pretty similar to how it did in 2015. AI, to state the obvious, is this incredible why now for many of these companies. It provides this dislocation moment, both in terms of what the technology can do, right? How it can impact the industry, but crucially in the willingness for buyers to really mobilize and feel like they have high urgency to make a change. I think what is really combined is this characteristic of like, what is the scale of the problems we care about? Yeah. Right? In my case, I came from financial services, I came from Revolut. You can measure that industry in percentage of GDP terms, right? And that is something that's a very important North Star for me. I don't want to question on TAM. I want to know we can build a generational company. But it's combined with this emphasis that I had to learn, honestly, over the last 4 or 5 years of finding a why now. It is very clearly articulated that implies a high level of urgency, because a lot of the companies that I partner with, they're typically in markets where there are legacy incumbents. And as I say, for the cultural alpha thing to matter, there needs to be an assumption there's a large number of people that is relatively low talent density that will not be able to do this unless we inject some of this technology innovation directly.
And are there industries or categories that you're looking at which you think are particularly ripe for disruption with this kind of cultural alpha?
Yeah, I think like a particularly important piece, maybe I mentioned a couple. One, I'm very interested in healthcare, I think as a problem statement. As you know, in most European countries, it's between 10 to 15% of GDP. It's an industry where there wasn't a lot of urgency for technology to be introduced. And frankly, there wasn't regulatory structures for a long time for somebody to be able to use AI to make a clinical decision or make a recommendation. I think if you think about like shaping forces that will shape all of our lives, obviously over the full arc of our lives, I think it's access to healthcare. I think the reality for that is, a lot of it today is being constrained to physical locations, in person, primary and secondary care. Very little of it takes place, inside of our homes. Very little of it, as we get older, will take place in a sort of remote context to check that we're okay, to monitor things like, dementia that may be emerging in some of us over time. So I think technology can touch all of these different pieces, and it's actually a domain where Europe has an unfair advantage, right? In most European countries, we digitized our electronic medical record systems in the 1990s, early 2000s. The US was 2011 plus. And we have this incredible density of engineering talent. We have regulation actually here that is pretty progressive in terms of thinking about software as medical devices, how to get these things classified to be able to sell in these health systems. And crucially, I think we have a population that needs it, right? The customer need is incredibly present, aging populations in many countries. And if I think about our business, this notion of cultural alpha, what we really try and do is take these entrepreneurs who are incredible, again, functional specialists, and sort of orientate them and make them aware that there are these opportunities. We can do that at Sequoia because we have this relatively global perspective. And I would say healthcare is kind of paramount. I think the other thing I would say, for entrepreneurs here who are thinking about what to work on, how to think about their time, we use a few frameworks to get to that. One, I think, is you can think in, as I said, percentage of GDP terms. But two is look at the companies that exist in those industries and look at the quality of the technology teams that sit inside these organizations and think about it on a relative basis, right? Look at the insurance company with 20,000 employees but 200 software engineers. That's a good fact. Look at the companies that have technical talent but they lack, the ability to build super low latency systems to make decisions very quickly and sort of tease apart where you see the lack of talent density inside of these incumbents and where you think if you have the right approach, you can add something on top.
And where do you think the opportunity for Europe is to pull out this cultural alpha? Where are these potentially future founders who have this cultural alpha but aren't working on an idea yet, that aren't ready to be a founder? Yeah. Where are you looking to find them?
So what I would say is, firstly, events like this are an amazing multi-point for it. The reason is a lot of these businesses are built at the intersection, right, of these two different domains. Actually, a lot of it is understanding that, of course, in your everyday job, you're exposed to people that come from your industry. What you need to do is lean into the long tail. By recognizing that actually finding people that have totally different skill sets to you in this environment is maximally productive. So if we look at what we do, we think pretty carefully at our Sequoia events of that construction. Right? We want to make sure that a quant trader is meeting someone who's a lawyer. Right? That would never happen. They'd never have a real conversation otherwise. Because the reality is that in today's world, you don't know where that inspiration will come from. We need to make sure that we improve that injection.
And how can Sequoia keep winning in this new age of AI?
In the age of AI, a lot of it, the pressures on being an entrepreneur, I think, are more aggressive than they've ever been. Right? The reality is the opportunities are great. Right? The prize is incredibly large. There are more companies founded per unit time in any category than in any other period in history. Right? So the pressure on you as an entrepreneur, potentially building a business for the first time, thinking about doing it at literally warp speed, recognizing that previously you might recruit a chief sales officer or someone to lead go-to-market, and today that person might have lasted you 2.5 years previously. Now it may be 6 months, right, before you're coming up to the upper bound of what they've seen before. So everyone is kind of growing and feeling that pain together. I think what is useful is working with someone like a Sequoia. We've been in business now for 55 years. We've seen companies at almost every level of scale. And there's a level of, hopefully, peace that we can try and introduce into that operational process. And it comes sometimes from us as partners, but honestly, it comes from having entrepreneurs in our portfolio who've seen that level of scale. Because I always believe that companies are, at the end of the day, millions of decisions made in a certain order that lead to a certain outcome. Your sequencing is unique, but not necessarily all of those individual decisions are. So our job is to surround you with that bench of people. And in AI, I would say the intensity of that is even greater.
Interesting. Well, look, George, thank you so much for joining me. It's been great chatting.
Thank you all.